Welcome to Software Engineering Daily. Today's episode is really special. It's one of my favorite interviews that I've done in the past. Since today is Christmas, I'm not sure how many people are listening, and I feel like I have some creative leeway. So we're going to air an interview that I did with Moisey Uretsky, the co-founder of DigitalOcean, and I did this interview for a different podcast called the Quoracast, and I did it back when I was doing the Quoracast. I did not have very many listeners. This was probably a year ago or a little less than a year ago. I stopped doing that podcast, the Quoracast, because I didn't have any listeners. It wasn't really gaining any traction. I did like 63 episodes. That's like 63 hour-long episodes where people weren't really listening. So that was the podcast where I really cut my teeth and learn some of the technology and the interview strategies that I use. But if you like Software Engineering Daily, you might like those old episodes of the Quoracast, especially if you like the format of this particular episode. The reason this episode is kind of offbeat and isn't entirely on topic is because it's not entirely about software engineering. Moisey understands engineering. He is a hacker, but he's also a super smart businessman. He managed to start a hosting business with his brother and their third co-founder, Mitch Weiner, that this business competes with AWS. DigitalOcean is a competitor with AWS, Amazon, and Azure and Google, arguably, but they're in a really, really interesting niche of usability, and we talk about what differentiates DigitalOcean throughout this show. And again, this is before I had DigitalOcean as an advertiser. I was not even thinking about DigitalOcean as an advertiser. This was long before Software Engineering Daily, so this was not like a long lead time thing. DigitalOcean is now, of course, a sponsor of the show, but I'm happy about that because of our prior interactions. So, I hope that all the listeners are having a great Christmas, or maybe you're listening to this long after I posted it and it's not Christmas at all when you're listening to it right now. But I'm spending Christmas alone with my cats in my apartment. I spent Christmas Eve with some friends, but I'm preparing episodes for the new year. I'm having a great solitary Christmas. It's going to be a great year for Software Engineering Daily. We have some really cool stuff coming down the pipes. As always, if you have any feedback, send us an email at softwareengineeringdaily@gmail.com, or you can tweet at us, Software Daily. Or at Software Daily, I should say. That's our Twitter. And you can sign up for the Slack channel or the email list at our website, softwareengineeringdaily.com. Don't worry, these super long intros won't become the norm. This is just me taking advantage of Christmas, I guess. So finally, since it's Christmas, I want to express gratitude to the producer of Software Engineering Daily, Pranay Mohan. He is the enabler of the frenetic pace of this podcast, and he's behind the scenes. I interviewed him for episode 100, but many newer listeners probably don't know who he is. So he works super hard, just as hard as I do. And this podcast wouldn't be possible without him. So that is my shred of gratitude. I've got plenty of other things to be grateful for, but in terms of what to mention to the listeners. So let's get on with the episode and my interview with Moisey Uretsky. And yeah. Moisey Uretsky is the co-founder of DigitalOcean, a leading cloud hosting provider. Moisey, welcome to the Quoracast.
Hey, great to talk to you, Jeff. Great to be here.
So give me some background on your biography and your psychology, and then we can talk about DigitalOcean.
My biography and my psychology.
Give me the finer points.
It's the usual immigrant story. Excuse me. My parents moved to America when we were about 4 and 5. My older brother is Ben, who is also a co-founder of DigitalOcean. We were poor, didn't have much money, so our parents focused on education. We went to the best high school in New York City, which is Stuyvesant, and then from there I went to NYU to study mathematics, which is a horrible career choice. And I was basically just bored during my first summer break, and my brother had a job being the CTO of a hosting company. So I would stop by his office, which at the time he was working out of a data center, like literally sitting inside the cage with all the noise of the servers and the AC units. And I just started reading books about it. I really was more into writing code, or like in my younger days actually cracking software. And I never really liked Linux too much, but I figured, okay, fine, I'll learn it. And then 3 weeks later, he went to a conference and said, okay, you're taking over for me and you're going to be a sysadmin. And I was like, all right, fine, we'll figure it out. And from there, we basically started our first company, which was a managed hosting provider a couple of years later. And from there, it was just a journey of like one company to the next to the next. So in between that company, which is ServerStack and DigitalOcean, I also started another startup, which was a Core Group, a hedge fund analytics startup. But that one was a bit complicated to really sell because you're selling to hedge funds or fund to funds, and the sales process is really long and rather complicated.
Did you make any sales? Because that sounds like such a high touch type of.
I did make one sale, so I was really happy about it. I mean, I had some obviously sales experience from ServerStack, where for a long time it was basically the first year was just me working, pretending to be about 4 people to kind of show people that we were a bigger company than we were. But I did manage to make one sale to a fund to fund out in the UK, so that was pretty exciting given the size of the contract was also rather large. But ultimately, it was just product market fit in that category is. Extremely complicated, and the financial industry is. After I got to know it from the inside out, I was appalled at how bad the data was, and just it's pretty much a nightmare. Like I don't envy any single financial startup, regardless of like what space they focus on, whether it's consumer or the enterprise space.
Okay, so and how did these companies that didn't succeed to the level of DigitalOcean, how did that experience affect you going into DigitalOcean?
Oh, I mean, it was really formative. It was tremendously formative for us. I mean, our first company, ServerStack, which was doing managed hosting, so you could really compare that to Rackspace. We made pretty much every single classic business mistake that you could imagine, because we didn't have, we didn't take any business courses. We were kind of learning everything ourselves. You also have to remember this is about a decade ago in the New York City startup scene, where there really weren't that many startups. There wasn't much of a community. So we made every mistake possible, whether it was hiring mistakes, firing mistakes, classic business mistakes, like not understanding marketing, advertising, or really how like to attract customers, or how to position your company, or how to, speak your mission statement and attract customers. And all of those lessons were really painfully learned, and they were expressed in slow growth. I mean, obviously the internet was growing tremendously fast, so the company was successful, but it just wasn't able to really capture the kind of success that was available in the space. And from there, doing a service-based business, the realization was that it's easier to start because you get a customer in the first month, but it's really hard to scale. So that's why the second company was focused on the product side. Basically build something and sell it to, whether it's 10 people or 100 people, was really a big change. And then from there, DigitalOcean kind of seemed like the natural outgrowth. I mean, it was an industry that we understood really well. We thought that we could really position our company into a very unique space there. And obviously, it's going to be a product company, so that if we were able to figure out the product market fit, it could potentially grow much faster than either ServerStack or another venture that we could pursue.
Okay, sure. So let's talk a little more about DigitalOcean. So in 2012, your brother Ben decides that he wants a new approach to cloud hosting. Explain the business offering and why did it make sense to come into this environment? So this environment already has Amazon Web Services, Google, and Heroku at this point, and certainly other ones. So it was kind of interesting situation where actually there's even more niches, and you found one. So maybe provide some detail on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a classic case of like what Peter Thiel talks about, is that you have to be a contrarian. So obviously, if you look at the space, it seems like the worst idea in the world to start another, cloud hosting provider in a very crowded space, in a relatively mature space with the internet as well. It seems like a really hard idea. And, in hindsight, it actually was a pretty bad idea. What we had going for us was that we just didn't know any better because this is our domain expertise. And, we had, Ben had bought the domain DigitalOcean probably about 2 or 3 years prior. We just never kind of had everything fit together. And it wasn't until we found Jeff, our other co-founder, through Craigslist while he was applying for a sysadmin position at ServerStack. And we have this test that we give to every employee, and he scored 100. And we're like, okay, it's impossible to score 100 on this exam because you miss, a cron tab file or something. There's just no way you could do 100. And as we kind of dug into his background, we saw that he was one of the people that built GoGrid. And it was obvious that, he was a great cloud architect. So between him, myself, and another person that I met during the core group days, Alec, who was doing the front end work, we kind of had the people that we needed to finally build this company. And then from there, it was basically just looking at the space and saying, what could we do different that no one else is focusing on? And, that answer was pretty obvious to us on day one, which was, what was missing from all the other providers was simplicity, because I have a background in, as a developer and also as a sysadmin, and every single system that I played with, they were just overly complicated for me. I wanted to basically spin something up and start writing code. And there were so many steps to get a virtual server online that it felt like if we can just minimize the time between logging in, getting an account, and getting your first virtual server online, that there could be a real fit in the market.
Right, and so explain some of that complexity, because I think it's actually kind of a finer point what that complexity manifests as. Because in AWS, for example, my experience is that the complexity manifests itself in this very domain-specific way of configuring your stuff. Like if you want to go on AWS and build a complicated system, you have to understand the domain-specific notions of AWS. Do you think that's a fair distinction to make between that and DigitalOcean?
Absolutely. I mean, AWS is a phenomenal. Amazon is a phenomenal company. AWS is a phenomenal service. But as that service has grown, even at the start, but much more so now, the learning curve is really, really steep. To get in there and just understand what is the mixture of services you need to put together and what way to actually run your infrastructure could be a little daunting for people that are just starting out. And likewise with the other niche providers, there was a lot of things that were no longer relevant that you were kind of forced to jump through hoops, like thinking about partitions and all these other things. And these are, carryovers from, back when, hard drives were counted in megabytes, not in gigabytes. And a lot of those kind of constructs didn't make much sense. But really it was, pushing even further beyond that is, most of the companies that operate in this space were very engineering focused, and they really kind of looked at it from the engineering perspective, and nobody put the product perspective first. And for us, it was really important to say instead, what should the product be? What should it look like? What should it feel like? What should the control panel look like? How should you navigate through it? Even the APIs, what is an API call that makes sense, that makes things simple, and then work our way backwards from there into the actual technology. And no one really followed that perspective, because if you get a bunch of engineers together, more often than not, you're going to have a very engineering-focused solution, but often there could be a disconnect from making it readily available and acceptable to people. And then the other problem that you have is, if you're an engineer at an e-commerce site, you don't really have to be passionate about the product itself because you're solving interesting engineering challenges. But if you're building a product that's catering towards engineers and developers, obviously all of your engineers are very interested in what the product is doing, which is why oftentimes when you see these sorts of products, they do feel different than like an iPhone or an app, because they really put the engineering first instead of realizing that the engineering first doesn't always give you the best experience. And that's why we always went backwards from the product side instead of going from the engineering side.
So could you differentiate that a little more? Because what is the difference if you're thinking of from an engineering perspective? versus thinking from a product perspective that is designed for engineers, right? Like the product is designed for engineers. So what's the difference there? And maybe you could somehow work Heroku into the conversation, because I think Heroku is it's almost like simplified AWS in a sense, but obviously it's different than DigitalOcean. But Heroku seems like a more product focused
Yeah,
version of AWS maybe. But I don't know. What do you think?
yeah, absolutely. I think Heroku is a great example as well, and they're really, they've done a superb job. And what I mean by, product comes first is you're really focused on what is the problem that you're solving for somebody, and more importantly, when you're solving that problem, how do you want that person to feel? And that's a conversation that's always really complicated to lead with people, because it's really about kind of, gut feel, playing with a prototype, playing with these various APIs, or playing with the control panel, so that after you finish doing whatever you're doing, do you have a sense of joy? So for us, when we first built it took us about 6 months to build DigitalOcean. I remember the first day that we actually got to like spin up our first virtual server, and it was kind of interesting because we were running DigitalOcean from DigitalOcean, so it was kind of like Inception based, But it was really cool because I went through the create process, I spun up that first droplet, and right away I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. All I want to do is spin up a bunch more servers, and I want to, build some Rails app and just, toss it on there. So, it left me feeling really wonderful and like really happy. And I obviously, part of that was, I was part of the creation process. So obviously I would have some kind of intrinsic attachment to it. But if we could capture that same kind of emotion in other people, then we would be onto something. And I think Heroku has done a great job of that as well, because they said, AWS is this great infrastructure, but it's a bit alienating. Like, how do we get a person to solve the problem of how do I go from writing my code to having it online? And that's where they focus, and that's why they've done so well. With Heroku, there's their business history is a bit more complicated. Obviously they got acquired rather early in their history by Salesforce, and Salesforce did a really good job to stay out of their business and give them a lot of leeway. But ultimately we're slightly different. What DigitalOcean, our mission is to give you as much control as possible so that you could set things up in any way, shape, or form you want. And Heroku, it's a bit more curated. So if you kind of fall into their curated model, then you have a fantastic experience. But if you begin to grow your infrastructure, at some point you begin to run into some of those roadblocks, and there's like, you can't quite scale it as far as you want. And then you sort of begin thinking about moving your infrastructure somewhere else.
Yeah, so in one answer, you described the differences between Heroku and AWS and DigitalOcean. You said that Heroku is great for hands-off development, AWS is great for massive scale, and DigitalOcean is for applications where you want to learn about systems and you need root access. So what are some examples of this, where this being less of a walled garden? Where are some examples where that's an important application?
Well, I think I think when you get past the point of if you kind of look through the history of like company formation, I think right by the time that you really hit to that product market fit, depending on how well you've done it or how big the market is, you can experience really fast, dramatic growth that's very unexpected. I mean, we certainly hit that ourselves. I think right around the point that you go through that transition period is when you want to be more hands-on, because you realize you've gone from building this idea, putting it in front of people and hoping that somebody likes it, to now people actually do like it, people are using it, and now it's beginning to scale. So all of those 1% errors that you could ignore when you had 100 users, at 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, they become much more critical. And ultimately, the way that the system scales, how is your database set up? What kind of caching do you have? All of those things that didn't matter before now suddenly creep into the picture. And now you're also running a real business as opposed to just starting an idea. And that's when, you really, you trust the infrastructure provider to give you the bare necessities like, network, power, CPU. But when it comes to actually managing your application, most developers feel more comfortable being in there and doing it themselves, because it's kind of related to how you write code. You write code, you have some error, you want to know exactly what line the error is on, and you want to go in there and fix it. And there's the same thing kind of goes on in the other space as well. Is like, unless the service is going to work 100%, if you have an error, you rather be reliant on yourself to fix it than have your infrastructure provider fix it. And that's why some of these more primitive building blocks have had much more success in the market than kind of more curated experiences, which is why AWS is so large and Heroku, as phenomenal as they are still a much smaller percentage of the market than AWS itself.
Tell me about the minimum viable product that you built, because it's I have trouble like conceiving of how you would build something where, because it's one of these things where, like, DigitalOcean is one of these things where you get like, you get you start to get a lot of value out of the business you start to get a lot of value out of the business with economy of scale. And it's like, it's one of these like almost like commodity type businesses. It seems like to me. So, but when you were first just starting out and you're like, sort of a scrappy startup, did you just like buy a couple servers and then just like have DigitalOcean running on that, or like what exactly was your?
It definitely helps that if you're going to build a cloud, you have a source of money somewhere else, because no investor in their right mind is going to give you money.
Right.
And we spoke to quite a few of them, and they all said, how are you different from Amazon? And we're like, well, we're going to be cheaper and faster, and we're also going to have a better experience. And they're like, yeah, that's not possible. And we're like, well, we're going to do it anyway. So that's where it helps to have another company which is generating money, so that you could just kind of pump all that money into DigitalOcean. And it helps to have bad accountants, so they never tell you, hey guys, you kind of blew $1 million already and you're not making any money from this. Do you still want to keep doing this? So it really is very, very difficult to start. The other complexity also is that you're managing infrastructure. And if you look at any startup that's purely software versus anything that's hardware, the hardware ones will tell you, it's a million times more complicated. You can't just write some code and ship a new version. You have to deal with physical logistics. And I always tell people that if you want to think about like in-housing your infrastructure, if you've never bled in the data center, like lost blood, then you should not be doing it. And if you have, then your answer is, oh God, please don't do that, because I've bled in a data center. I know what it's like. So it's really a culmination of, kind of bad decisions that led us there. And as far as the MVP, we were kind of in an interesting space where there were already a lot of competitors, and we kind of made a few mistakes on that because we actually probably put too much into our first initial release, trying to focus on feature parity with some of the other providers, instead of really focusing more on like, what's the main building block, and then letting the customers kind of dictate more from there. We had the roadmap, but we could have certainly waited to have, to gain some of that initial traction, have customers ask us for a feature like snapshots, and then build it and roll it out. So we probably put a little too many features into the first version than we should have.
Right, but so what was the setup? Did you have like a couple servers in your apartment, or?
Oh, well, no. ServerStack was already it was already a large, profitable business doing millions of dollars in revenue.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of piggybacked off of their infrastructure and set up in the same data centers. So at that point, we had New York City and Amsterdam, and we kind of used that to leverage us going forward and just put servers into those same facilities and use the same network, so we could focus more on the software development side and not the infrastructure side.
Was DigitalOcean just a rebranding of ServerStack?
No, it was a completely separate entity. So it was completely incorporated differently. It was a totally different company. It just so happened that we ran two companies at the same time. And then when the seed round happened, obviously the investors were interested in DigitalOcean, not this old legacy company. So DigitalOcean had to acquire ServerStack because the finances and the IP and everything was way too tightly integrated. But ServerStack was a completely privately owned company that was just mine and Ben's, so there was no shareholder kind of issue, because it was just, the founders of DigitalOcean happened to be the founders of ServerStack, so it was a very smooth transaction.
What was the business model of ServerStack?
It was basically, it was a service business where we would just, set up servers in a data center and try to sell them to customers. And our position was that we would provide the best managed service on the planet. So if you wanted us to install software like, Apache, Nginx, WordPress, whatever, we would install it, configure it, optimize it, and scale it. And we did really well at that. But we couldn't compete with Rackspace because their brand and their positioning and their messaging was way too strong that people felt like if you want the best managed host, you go to Rackspace. So we even had customers leave us thinking that we provided poor service, go to Rackspace, and they get into a contract. And then when the contract expires, they'll come back to us at ServerStack and be like, oh, okay, you guys had great service. We just didn't know your service was so good. But it was just a business that we couldn't grow because the sales cycle was too long. We really weren't differentiated in this space, and we really weren't providing anything new. We were just doing a much better job about caring about the customer experience, and that certainly helped DigitalOcean in the sense that obviously when you have hundreds of thousands of customers, customer service becomes really critical. So having a background already doing that helped us to focus on that area immediately and really kind of scale it out.
Yeah, it almost sounds like you were kind of a boutique server installation service. I don't know, is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of say like the ServerStack was like the incubator for DigitalOcean. It's kind of like where we learned most of our mistakes and then use those mistakes to figure out, okay, how did we do the exact opposite of that? So go from a service business to a product business, and then just use the lessons that we learned in terms of like how to run infrastructure at a large scale so that when DigitalOcean did take off, hopefully we would be able to scale the infrastructure as well. And that was really essential because even going to Techstars, one of the big questions they had is like, okay, so you're building this cloud, but do you guys even know how to build a cloud? And being able to say, well, we already have a business that's on 2 continents running gigabits of transit, hundreds of servers. They're like, oh, okay, so you guys know what you're doing on the hardware side. So there's a lot more trust there. So really, without the experience of ServerStack, we would not have been able to build DigitalOcean into what it is today.
And so my understanding is that DigitalOcean is, you're differentiated. Like one of the axes that you're differentiated on is like the customer service level, the like customer friendliness level. How do you scale that?
Well, I think the best way to scale anything is to provide a great product. I mean, if you look at it this way, right? If you have a great product that's intuitive and easy to grasp and understand, you get less support questions, right? If the product works well, you get less support questions. And the rest of it is you hire aggressively. So our customer support team is the largest team in our company because we do have a lot of customers. And really, it's kind of the thing that you put into your mission statement, into the vision of the company either early on or you don't. And through our experience at ServerStack, we felt really passionately about customer service. So at the beginning of DigitalOcean, when we didn't really have much in the way of funding, you probably had a 50% chance that I was going to be answering your support tickets myself. And I mean, support is a critical function because that's where you get to see from the product side, what's not working, what doesn't make sense to your customers, how can you improve the experience for them. So I think any company that kind of doesn't have some sort of a focus there is, not doing the best that they could. I mean, you have to either be like Apple and just say like we're the exception to the rule, or otherwise you really want to focus on the customer service side. And I think Slack even is in the same position where they've grown really rapidly, and the customer service team is one of the largest teams they have as well, because it's just essential to what you're doing.
Yeah. Another one of the differentiators that I see is the community aspect, like and I saw this talk that one of your early employees or co-founders, I'm not sure how he's classified, Mitch Weiner was giving an interview, or he was being interviewed, and he mentioned his this customer acquisition strategy that involved having all this content on DigitalOcean. And I've seen it because like I've gone on. In fact, I think I went on DigitalOcean, or like I searched like how to do something in Heroku, and it was on DigitalOcean.
Yeah, I mean that kind of came out of a business mistake as well. So about 5-6 years ago, my time might be a little off. Everything gets compressed when you're doing a startup. But we found out about Nginx back when all the documentation was in Russian. And we set it up, we played with it. We're like, wow, this is a pretty cool web server. And at the time, we had a lot of customers running WordPress, and WordPress at scale doesn't work really well, especially if you have like plugins and all this other stuff. So we did this really basic kind of Nginx install. This was before Nginx could even do PHP. We just put Nginx in the front, and it would just reverse proxy back for any non-static request, over to Apache running WordPress. And just doing that one simple thing where it could load like, JPEGs or CSS files through Nginx automatically reduced the load on the server by 50%. And, we mistakenly thought, oh my God, this is some cool stuff we figured out. What if we share this? Our competition will figure out how to do it, and then we won't have this advantage about pitching these WordPress customers. Obviously, that was a stupid approach. It didn't work. And ultimately what happened is that we never shared that information early in the life cycle, and we never got any kind of thought leadership in the space, when in reality, had we shared that information, people would discover it. And it doesn't mean that they would become our customer, but it would certainly open up that potential. So we kind of look at the community the same way. Like, we've been doing this for, over a decade at this point. There's a lot of domain knowledge that we have. And the mission for our community was, as a advanced developer, as a advanced system administrator, why can't we go to one place to see how to do, any kind of installation, configuration, or optimization? And, when we first started, the community was really small. It was actually just one person doing all the work. And that's Atel. She's our director of community now. And, she was our first employee, and she would literally sit there, read a how-to, learn how to do it, then do it herself, then rewrite it. And because her background and her schooling was actually in literature, she wrote the tutorials in a very specific voice, which was really kind of explaining it to people because she was actually learning it herself. And always the goal for the community was, can we get it to the point that if I wanted to learn something, the first place that I would go to is DigitalOcean. And literally last year was the first time that occurred. So like with Mesosphere, which is really cool, I was like, oh man, this is cool. If I have some free time, I want to play with this. And then we had articles about it. So we went from these much more basic, how do you install Rails, to much more complicated articles. And that's just something that we care about tremendously. I mean, probably 90% of the people that visit those tutorials are not DigitalOcean customers and may never be. But it's just still part of our mission to just provide that education because it's invaluable, and it's things that we actually ourselves use as well.
Yeah, and it's also like an area where Stack Overflow hasn't really been able to capture completely. Because Stack Overflow, I think of as just like a QA, like you get a short answer that's like within like 3 or 4 paragraphs. But there are all kinds of tasks that you have to do. Especially if you're like rolling your own X, like if you're building something, if you're deploying something, oftentimes it takes several steps, like a lot of steps. And it's like, it's either you can do 5 searches on Stack Overflow for the different steps you're doing, or you can just do like find a DigitalOcean tutorial. It's pretty cool. I want to roll back a little bit and talk about your past and how what was it like growing up with Ben? Like what kind of what did you guys do growing up that sort of led you in this direction of being entrepreneurs or developers?
It's interesting. I think we came to America. I was about 4 or 5. My brother is about a year older than I am. And, he was always really passionate about computers, but we were, like I said, very poor. So we got our first computer, I think at around, Ben was about 13 or so, I was 12. And we obviously spent most of our time on there. So, back in the day it was AOL, and you had a dial-up modem, and, you started off playing some video games and
right,
just,
like freeware or shareware games that you download in like a little AOL download walled garden area.
From there you kind of find out about IRC. You find out about some apps that like steal passwords. And then it just so happened that my mom was switching careers, and she started, doing some Visual Basic. So I kind of stole her book and printed out the huge Windows API because I wanted to write my own app to do the same thing. And this was with like no computer science background or whatsoever. I got about halfway through. I went far enough, but I couldn't quite finish it. And then he's just doing this stupid stuff that kids do, like started cracking software. So that was like a bunch of reading assembly and trying to make sense of it. But we kind of always had a strong work ethic because that's kind of what our parents and our grandmother beat into us, which is that, we're here, we were actually living really well in Russia. But when we immigrated, this was before everything got reformed. So we had no money to take with us. Our dad kind of, he was yelling a lot at us to be good at studying and educating ourselves. And, Ben kind of went off and started working with a few friends at this hosting company, and I was just bored. And then from there, just, it was just one thing leads to another. Like, I never had a resume. I never applied for a job. I don't even know. I've read a lot of resumes. I've interviewed a lot of people, but I've unfortunately never been in that position. But I think once you can do this once or twice or three times, it's certainly really addictive, and you look at things a different way. You never see things from the perspective of an employee if you've never actually been one. So there's never anything where it's like, no, we can't do that, or no, we can't figure it out, because you're a co-founder of a company. Like, you have all of the tools at your disposal. So it's your job to figure out what needs to be done and how it needs to be done and how you can keep pushing forward. And I think that's a really unique perspective. Maybe it's someday I want to have a job at a company like Google just to kind of get a taste of what a regular job looks like. But everybody says I'll hate it and want to quit after a month, which they're probably right about.
Yeah, they're right. So I've got a couple brothers, and they both program, but we've never really like worked on anything together. It's one of these weird things. Like and over the past couple of years, I've kind of been ramping up my pitch to them, where I'm like, we really should just start a company because it makes sense. There's actually not a whole lot of people in the world that can program relative to the opportunities you have available. But I'm not sure I have really been able to like get through to them, I guess. But so what do you how could I convince them to like jump into something like is there something like special that you can articulate about working with your brother?
I think it just sort of happens naturally. For me and Ben, it was just kind of a situation where he had a job and I just stopped by to learn stuff, and then he gave me a job, and then from there, when he was like, look, I saved up some money, let's start a company, like, he naturally just came to me first and said, let's start a company. And the company we were working for was going out of business. So I was like, well, I just dropped out of school and I have to pay for this car that I got because I was going through my midlife crisis, as it were. I was like, okay, yeah, let's do this thing. So it was really kind of just a natural progression of things. I think like working with family, like with brothers, it's definitely a unique dynamic. And I think one thing that I can say for certain is that whatever the dynamic is between the brothers, that will be the dynamic that plays out at the office. We've spoken to like, John and Patrick Collison from Stripe, and just kind of like, hey, you guys are brothers. This is already your second company. Like, how do you guys do it? Yeah, and I think there's a lot of positives and negatives to it. I mean, the one positive is that you are brothers, you are family, so there's a much higher level of implicit trust than with any other person in the organization. But I think the main negative is that, whatever the familial relationship is going to carry over to the workplace unless you strictly enforce boundaries and really kind of, almost recreate your internal culture where you're creating a work relationship and using that foundation of trust beneath it. And me and Ben have always just kind of butted heads even when we were kids. So we obviously took a lot of that into our business as well. And, after a certain point, you realize that dynamic no longer works. The company is too big for that. And I like to say that if you take the number of founders and you multiply that by 7, that's a point at which everything in the company begins to shift from doing tactical things to now being focused on culture. And for us, it's like when we hit about like that 30 to 50 employee mark, it was like, okay, well, this dynamic needs to get improved over time. We have to focus much more on culture and reestablish how we work with each other, because it's, you have so many new employees, so many people have not been through the formative struggle years. They don't know your personalities as well, and you kind of just have to go through this transition all over again.
Yeah, so talk some more about that. Like, how has that manifested into certain decisions? Because, like, what one of the most recent interviews I did was with the CEO of Phil's Coffee, and I was asking him about how he scales culture, because it seems like just super difficult to me. And actually, it's like, I think to people outside of companies, maybe it's oftentimes like something that is easy to overlook, but like the culture thing is just so crazy important, because once you lose it, you can't get it back, and it basically like drives all the innovation. It drives enjoying working at a company. So, like, what are some specific examples of how you've maintained the cultural health?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally true that culture at a certain point becomes everything. I think we got, for me, that lesson happened because of Burning Man, and this was right around the time we had 35, 40 people at the company, and there was this great documentary that came out called Spark, one of the few documentaries about Burning Man. So I went there to watch it, and obviously I've been a number of years. It was probably my fourth year that I had gone at that point. And, so I had the experience of being at Burning Man, and I'm watching how it was created. And, you hear all the stories, but it's different when you hear it directly from the founders of Burning Man. And basically, Burning Man was anarchy up to the point where it was several thousand people. And during one of those festivals, like, things got a little haywire, and they felt like, oh my God, people are going to die. We're going to have murder committed. Luckily, no one died. They went back to San Francisco and they said, okay, we can't do any more Burning Mans unless we put down some principles to help like create some sort of structure. And that was interesting because like that's the first sign of culture, right? Because one of the co-founders actually decided to leave Burning Man because to him, the culture of Burning Man was this complete state of anarchy. And the second that you put a single rule in there, you were no longer the same Burning Man. And so what they did is they put these 10 principles together. And what's interesting is that, when I go to Burning Man, like, you have this experience. And to me, you could go to any music festival and hear great music. You go to a bunch of great museums and see great art. To me, the most magical thing about Burning Man is being around, this community of 60,000 people where you're on the same wavelength, like you're really communicating with each other, like the culture that's created, the self-selection that goes on to travel so far and commit yourself to this week-long experiment, just creates this really unique environment. And at that time, I thought to myself, like, there's no one running around policing the 10 principles, right? No one's like saying, hey, pick up this trash you threw on the ground. Because it's like a self-reinforcing culture. And that's when I realized, hey, we have 30, 40 people. We're struggling with figuring out how to manage them. Over there, they have 60,000 people, and 20,000 probably are first-time burners, and everybody kind of gets it. And that's what culture is. It's basically for every single decision that you don't have a process, how can you entrust someone else to be in the same wavelength as you and think along the same lines? And I think that's a really complicated process because I think unless you've done this once or twice, or you just happen to really get it, or you had some great mentorship around culture, you definitely think about it much later than you should. But the reality of it is that, culture is not, yeah, you can write it down. You can write down values. You can write down phrases and sayings. But, ultimately, it's still going to be a collection of actions that you take, especially as like the core leadership of the company. And it's also going to be around communication and how often you're really talking about your values. And that's definitely something that, we're still, as a company, beginning to formulate around. I think the good news is that much like anything else, especially in a fast-growing startup, like if the culture is broken, it certainly sucks, but it doesn't mean that you can't move past it. Because the reality is that, the culture will always shift. Creativity Inc., which is a great book about Pixar, like they were even talking about how, the culture will shift based on the number of employees you have. I mean, at 200 people, they had this phenomenal culture, but at 1,000 people, where, like 200 people per film, some of these people are new. They don't know who like Ed is or who John Lasseter is, and they'll hear some of those people say, and they'll take it as like this is the literal truth and must be done, instead of like this is just a point of feedback and adjust to it. So I think like culture and values and those things, they're never they're never finished. It's kind of like it's just a direction that you choose and you keep going down it. There is no destination to arrive at, because you will have to adjust how you communicate your culture, how you communicate your values based on the number of employees you have, based on geography, whether you're a remote distributed workforce or you're in a single office. So it's just a constant process. I think the only way to really get good at it is to actually go through it. And if you've never actually done it yourself, then definitely get mentorship, whether it's other CEOs or co-founders, or just go to other places where culture is really strong and important, like Burning Man, and find other examples of that and just feed off of that and see how that kind of changes your perspective as well.
Yeah, so I'm reading Creativity Inc. right now. The book is like really good. It's very interesting how so many of the principles that he talks about, like he manages to articulate how to create this scalable artistic company. It's fascinating. Actually, and on Quora, there was an answer you gave where you mentioned that there were like 15 to 20 books that were instrumental in guiding the creation of DigitalOcean. So what were some of the books? Like what maybe the, I don't know, top 5 or something, the ones that you found most crucial?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, definitely positioning, crossing the chasm, lean startup, or the 4 steps to the epiphany if you want like the college edition version of it, which has a lot more detail. The idea virus, I think that one, I mean,
I love Seth Godin.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that you need to have some sort of virality, and to figure out how to like share the message of droplets is a little harder than sharing the message of like photos between friends. And I think like as time has gone on, like different books have begun to appear into that reading list of mine. I mean, obviously Creativity Inc. now is part of it as well. How Google Works, I think, is also a great book that kind of has a lot of examples about how Google built their culture. I think those 2 books create a nice parallel. How to Win Friends and Influence People. I always thought that was a funny title, but when I read the book, I was like, this is a book that pretty much anyone who manages people needs to read. It's going to make your life easier. Scrum, doing twice the work in half the time, and Managing the Design Factory, The Laws of Simplicity, and the Design of Everyday Things for like product thinking, kind of general.
Okay, so you mentioned lean startup, and also earlier in the discussion, you mentioned Peter Thiel, who he has like criticisms of lean startup, or like he thinks it's over influenced the way certain people operate. I think I had a conversation with somebody recently on the Quora cast, the CEO of Aptimize, Nancy Hua, and I talked to her about this, and like I don't know, one of the things that I think Thiel talks about is like the lean startup makes you kind of shoot for these local maxima. Like you go for these like low hanging fruit pivots that maybe don't actually like that's not what you should be aiming for. So is there anything in the lean startup that you were like maybe think is like skeptical, or you're skeptical of, or?
Yeah, I mean, lean startup is not my favorite one. I think that my favorite one is Managing the Design Factory, because I think that there's some important lessons behind a lean startup that people kind of take for granted. And that's the area that I focus on, which is like getting outside the building and talking to people. And that doesn't just mean talking to customers, but that also means that, if you're building whatever it is inside your company, you could probably find somebody in some other company that you respect that's built the same thing. You're not in a competitive space. Get outside the building, call them up on the phone, visit their office, talk to them, see how they built it. They'll tell you, here's the 5 things that were super awesome. Here's the 5 things they regret, they wish they could take back. And now you can do it so much better. I think a book that captures kind of a more holistic, and in my opinion, like how I look at product viewpoint is Managing the Design Factory. And that book is not well known. It's not even on Kindle, so you could imagine how little it's read.
What is that about? I've never heard of that.
So that's basically like product management the way that I look at it, which is basically based on things like information theory, queue theory, and that's or versus like big breakthrough innovation versus incremental innovation. So the thing that Peter Thiel was referring to with lean startup is absolutely true. And Managing the Design Factory kind of talks about it from a very specific viewpoint of the steam engine, which for a time was the dominant industrial force. And the problem with the whole lean startup, optimizing for local maxima is that you could never make enough incremental innovations in the steam engine to arrive at diesel or gas power. That has to be a breakthrough innovation. But at the same time, you have to focus on both, right? You have to, if you already have this product that's driving your revenue, you have to do the incremental innovation to continue to improve it so you have enough profit being made to have your R&D budget being spent on this large breakthrough, which may be, the iPhone or whatever else.
This is innovator's dilemma also, right?
Yeah, it's also innovator's dilemma. Like, how can you or innovator's solution, which I also love because then it covers the dilemma and it also talks about how do you do that if you're the one being disrupted. What do you do? But I think like a lot of product management is way too focused on. There's just not enough rigor behind it. And to me, and no one's really explaining it because the reality is like Scrum, Lean, product management, all of those things are based on the same exact thing. And they're all based on just-in-time inventory management from Toyota. And the thing with product management is that there's a slight variation, which is that when you're doing like what Toyota was doing, they were producing the same widget, right? And they wanted to be Six Sigma the same as the one they produced before. Whereas with product management, if you take all the variability out of what you're building, you have no risk, which means you have no reward. You're building the same product as somebody else. So you need to have a level of variability in what you're building. There has to be a level of risk because that's where you're going to create something new that's really going to drive forward profit. And then you have to figure out how do you balance those things, right? Because if it's 99% going to fail, okay, sure, if you can figure it out, it's going to be a tremendous success like Fusion, but you're also 99% going to fail. You're probably not going to succeed at it. Likewise, if you're 99% going to succeed, it's the same kind of, economy there.
What are some of like the weird problems that you've experienced while building DigitalOcean? Like, have there been any problems where like you're getting DDoSed or like people are using DigitalOcean in like sketchy ways?
Oh yeah, I think it's interesting because, I guess that's the reason why you should always focus on building something small and seeing what happens, because people will find all kinds of interesting ways to use whatever you build and surprise you. Obviously this DDoS that's kind of standard for the industry, but the biggest surprise was actually Bitcoin. Like all those cryptocurrencies, they really, that whole huge growth that Bitcoin experienced directly correlated when we were growing as well. So we had all of these customers signing up, developers trying to build applications and do their thing. Meanwhile, this cryptocurrency stuff is blowing up. So you have every single person with a stolen credit card trying to get in and trying to mine their cryptocurrency. And we were literally like, every morning I would come in and I would look through all the customers and I would see like the number of abusive signups. I would be killing off like a half month worth of growth every morning, which is how fast that they were coming back in. So as much as I think Bitcoin is really cool and I want it to succeed, I'm also personally really happy that right now currently it's kind of not growing fast and it's a little flat because it certainly means less problems for us.
That's like the PayPal problem, right? Where they had to like deal with so much fraud that it was like that was how they differentiated themselves, is like overcoming fraud.
Yeah, so there's always stuff like that. That one just stands out because it was literally like a big concern like every day, and it took up a lot of cycles.
So how did you deal with it? Because it doesn't sound like something that, obviously, it went away, or maybe it's like dissipating right now because the price of Bitcoin is low. But what if Bitcoin shot up again?
No, we have. Look, we use a lot of different technologies. I can't talk about any of them because if I mention them, then people will know exactly how to circumvent them. But we use everything from like off the shelf open source stuff to some stuff that we pay for through companies to a lot of things that we wrote in house. Ultimately, we have a lot of focus on abuse. We write a lot of code around that. And, obviously, as things happen, we try to improve it. The only unfortunate circumstance is obviously the better your filtering is for abusive people, you're always going to catch some people that are not abusive. And that's really kind of painful because it's really hard to kind of, pull those decisions back and forth. And it really kind of sucks to request from a customer, hey, can we see a driver's license or something like that just to get a virtual server? Because it's unfortunate, but just the scope of the problem was so large on our side that we had to put a lot of information behind it. There's just no way to deal with it on a manual case-by-case basis.
Is it the case like PayPal where you have to like put a layer of humans between in the approval process, and you have to say like, hey, we're going to send the server logs to every new every new user that we're going to send the server logs to a human that's going to parse them and like.
No, I mean we funnel the catch into our support system. So if you do get caught and you are a real person, you're going to be directed to open up a support ticket. So we do have a human being sitting in between that, which is also partially why our customer support team is the largest team that we have, because they're also dealing with all of those new signups which got caught, which are actually legitimate and not somebody using a stolen credit card or some other form of illegitimate activity, I'll say.
Have you found it difficult to scale in New York? Because you hear about like people say it's super hard to start, like it's exponentially harder to start a business in New York than it is in Silicon Valley.
No, I mean not exactly. I think where New York is on the map today, 10 years ago, I think absolutely, but today you actually do have a large number of local VCs. You have a large number of, SF or other VCs that have New York offices. Obviously, the New York VCs are very, very focused on investing in New York companies. 10 years ago, there weren't many startups at all. Today, we have a ton. We've definitely had a few successes here. I mean, we have Shutterstock that IPO'd. Etsy, I'm sure, is filing for an IPO really soon. Obviously, Tumblr was a huge success for those guys. And the thing of it is that hiring top talent is always hard. It doesn't matter what city you're in. It doesn't matter if it's a downturn in their economy or an uptick. Like the best people are always the ones that are the hardest to find. I think the benefit to New York is that there's a lot of people that get burnt out on other cities, whether it's San Francisco or somewhere else. And if you ask them to relocate to New York, it is a very vibrant, interesting city. So that does kind of play well. The other benefit also is that we have all these engineering offices from Twitter to Facebook to Google now, so they're actually like doing the same thing as well. And if somebody is working at Google in New York and they're kind of like, hey, I want to do a startup, but I don't want to leave New York because I fell in love with the city, it's a great place to kind of bring people together. I think the one thing that San Francisco has that New York doesn't quite have is that there's definitely more of an echo chamber inside of San Francisco. So if you're positioning your company to go after other companies, I think definitely San Francisco has New York beat. On the other hand, if you're looking for a density of population, something like a Foursquare, I think New York has San Francisco beat. So I think depending on which angle you want to go, so I think definitely companies like Stripe or Slack being in San Francisco definitely helps them a lot. Foursquare being in New York helps them a lot. For us, I mean, technically speaking, we should be in San Francisco, but we're in New York, and we love New York, and we want to help put a star on the map, and we can hope that we're hoping that DigitalOcean will be one of those stars for New York as well.
And DigitalOcean is you're really capex intensive business, and I mean, most people would agree that we're in some sort of boom right now. Whether it's like cyclical or not is that's up for debate. But there's got to be like some. I think most people agree there's some probability of like some kind of downturn in the future. I mean, or if there's not, then that's awesome because we're in some sort of permanent boom or some permanent like maybe things are just going to be better all the time from now on. Like VC money is always going to be awesome, but I don't know. Like, but how do you anticipate? I mean, I'm guessing that like a lot of your new usage is has some correspondence with the boom. I mean, if you have all these new developers, new companies, and whatnot, like it's probably pretty good for DigitalOcean. So, like, what is the like? Do you worry about the potential for a downturn leading to needing to scale back?
Not really, because right now, I think next quarter, if not next quarter, then sometime very soon, Amazon is going to finally split out AWS revenue and report on that individually. I think when they do that, the several billions of dollars of revenue, not valuation, but actual revenue that they're doing, is really going to highlight how massive they are. And I'd love for DigitalOcean to be at some point playing, as a true competitor, but that's going to take quite some time. So, we're obviously looking at the global financial kind of landscape. The boom won't obviously last forever. From a finances standpoint, that's kind of where economy of scale helps, because when we were first starting out, all of the various debt structures that we put together were very unfavorable to us. We had very high interest rates. And then as we've grown as a company, as we have a track record of being successful, as we've taken on investment, we've gotten much better terms. And for us, the good news is that our company is set up to succeed based on our old interest rates, which were much, much higher. So if the global financial landscape does change and the interest rate does go up, because our economy of scale has helped us to attract different kinds of debt structures, we'll be back to where we started and not just have a little bit of a boost in the interim. As far as the customer landscape, I mean, the thing of it is that DigitalOcean right now is a very global business. We're already in Singapore, London, Amsterdam, New York, San Francisco, and we're going to be launching Frankfurt very shortly. It's just that the internet as a whole is still growing. Developers as a whole, I mean, that's the largest growing sector of basically any professional kind of degree. So for the most part, it's still going to be there. I think that on a global kind of downshift, Amazon and AWS would be a lot more exposed. Because it's different when you're a small customer paying a much smaller sum versus a large customer that's paying a $5 million a month bill to AWS, because that's really going to eat into your bottom line, and then you might look to downsize or in-house or whatever else is that you're going to do. So and because we've already gone through a couple of we've gone through the massive downturn. We've been doing this for 12 years. We saw how it played out. It didn't really affect what we were doing. So we're optimistic that hopefully it won't have much of an impact, because we're optimistic. I mean, obviously it could affect other areas, but for us, we're optimistic that it won't affect us too much. I mean, it's kind of like, for the time being, maybe it's like alcohol consumption. If times are good, you celebrate, you drink alcohol. If times are bad, you drink alcohol because times are bad. So the internet as a whole in some various places is kind of in the same boat, because if something is falling off, there's just so much more usage somewhere else. As long as you're kind of being global about it, I think you can make up for the differences. That won't last forever, but for now.
I listened to this talk that Vinod Khosla gave, and one of the things he said was like, there actually wasn't an internet bust. Like people never stopped using the internet, right? I mean, there was a stock market bust, but people never stopped using the internet.
Yeah, it's still growing. That's the crazy thing. Until you can stream like HD video right to your phone with zero loss and zero latency, we haven't,
right to your Oculus.
Yeah, right. That's even better. Right to your Oculus. Until you can stream that live to whatever location you're in, so not in your house, not on your Wi-Fi, and stream like HD quality with zero latency, we haven't hit peak internet usage. And I think like we have a long way to go. I think the one interesting thing, I forgot who mentioned this, but they were talking about how there's only a billion customers that use landlines and bank accounts, I believe, or something, but there are 6 billion cell phones in the world. So there's still a lot of growth that's happening in the emerging markets. There's still a lot of dynamic things that are playing out. And I think the internet is one of those things that's really unique, because globalization had a lot of negatives, but a lot of positives. And I think the globalization as it applies to the internet is really unique because you really do become this global entity. And that's why DigitalOcean is focused on, expanding data centers across the world as well, so that we could be a part of that kind of globalization of, information across the world.
Awesome. Okay, well, Moisey Uretsky, thank you so much for coming on the Corecast. It's a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot for having me.